And now, friends, I want to invite you with me to do a little bit of learning about our Torah portion this week. This Shabbat, our reading of the book of Numbers continues with a variation on a theme that the Torah took up last week, and that is the census of the Israelite nation, in which Moses and Aaron, under instruction from God, meticulously catalog the tribes of Israel, their patriarchs and their chieftains. And now this week, following immediately after that long list of people's names and numbers, the Torah presents us with instead a list of objects, the equipment and accessories that are used to erect the wilderness tabernacle. The text lists all of the hardware used to assemble and disassemble the tent of meeting as the Israelites wandered through the desert, and God commands Moses about them in detail. Here's what God says: the planks, the bars, the posts, and the sockets of the tabernacle, the sockets, pegs, and cords, all the furnishings and fittings, you shall list by name these objects that are assigned to be carried. I'll say that once again, what God tells Moses: you shall list by name the objects that are assigned to be carried. Now, the traditional understanding of this commandment is that Moses was being directed to write an inventory, a bill of goods that would be consulted and double-checked each time the Israelites set out for a new destination on their journey to make sure that they hadn't left behind any critical pieces of equipment. Now, that was the conventional way that this verse was read, but in the 13th century, it was interpreted in a new way by the great Rabbi Nachmanides, a mystic and philosopher from northeastern Spain. When Nachmanides encounters that verse, you shall list by name these objects that are assigned to be carried, he had a different take on what the words meant. Nachmanides suggests that the traditional reading of that verse cannot be correct, and instead what it means is that when Moses was instructed by God to list by name the objects to be carried, he was instead to create a list of men's names, the lists of those people who were assigned to carry each one. This man will carry 2 planks of wood. That man will carry 6 tent pegs, and so on. Nachmanides teaches that the purpose of the list is not to keep track of the sacred inventory from the tabernacle. It had a different purpose. Because so much of the equipment was heavy and cumbersome, Moses wanted to make sure that each person's responsibility was written down and verified, lest one of them shirk the responsibility of carrying something heavy and opt instead to pick up a lighter burden that was easier to handle. Every week before Shabbat arrives, our clergy team gets together to have what we hope is a high-level conversation about these worship services, about what we want them to feel like, what kind of mood we'll try to create, what sorts of music will help achieve our spiritual purposes in what ways, and so on. So when I had this conversation with Cantor Simmons earlier this week about tonight's service, I told her that I just wanted this Friday night to feel light and joyful and easy, because all of us have been through so much during so many hard days, so many encounters with pessimism, with fear and hopelessness. I just wanted to connect with all of you and share a bit of happiness for a change. But then, in the last few days, as I watched the news continue to roll in, another African American dead, another white policeman charged, more burning buildings consumed by the flames of racism and violence, it became clear that I wasn't ready to be joyful just yet, after all. Although we have the choice to choose joy every day and at all times, we have the privilege to change the channel and focus on what is positive, and very often we take that choice because it feels better that way. But that is the moral infraction that Nachmanides taught us about with his reading of that verse from the book of Numbers. That ancient Israelite who knew that his job was to carry the heaviest beam but chose instead to pick up a few wooden pegs or a handful of linen cords. He picked up the lighter burden, even though he was obligated by conscience and by God not to do so, because it didn't hurt as much to carry. He didn't want anyone else to see him as shiftless or lazy. He wasn't so brazen as to go empty-handed altogether. He wanted a plausible excuse in case anyone looked sideways at him, so he could say, "Look, I'm helping. I'm carrying something too." But he chose instead to carry the lighter load. And with that choice, he forced others to carry his share. And so, even though it's heavy, even though it's uncomfortable and painful, I think we need to talk about what's happening in America. We need to talk about the experience of Black and brown Americans. We need to talk about what's happening tonight in Minneapolis and what's happened in South Georgia and Louisville, Kentucky, and Midland, Texas, and Central Park just in the last few days. It is uncomfortable, but we need to help carry that burden because we are Jews. We are people of conscience, and we need to help lift it up. But it is heavy. It's heavy, I know, for all of us white Jews in particular, who may have watched that terrible video of George Floyd gasping for breath, or who may have been unable to avoid the video of Ahmaud Arbery collapsing with a bullet in his back. What is the right moral response to these deaths? What is the Jewish response? How are we supposed to feel about the eruption of rage that is continuing again tonight and that follows every time this macabre cycle starts back up again? How should we Jews react when we read another story about another Black life imperiled or cut off prematurely? Another community of color suffering from medical negligence or inadequate civil infrastructure, another piece of legislation that will disproportionately impact our Black and brown neighbors. What should we think? And what should we do? Now, I want to acknowledge that the way we white Jews answer that question is unique, because as I don't have to tell you, we white Jews are targeted by bigotry and hatred as well. I want to share a story with you that happened just this week. A couple of days ago, I heard from friends in Minneapolis who were on their way out to join the protests against racism and violence. They were on their way spurred by their Jewish conscience to speak up for justice. And on their way to their local protest, they got a call notifying them that swastikas and neo-Nazi slogans had just been discovered painted outside their synagogue. At that moment, the Jewish dilemma that all of us face was made real in a pointed and unavoidable new way. It was pointed out what it means for us to be caught in that pincer grip, obligated to speak up against racism, but also painfully aware of our own vulnerability, our own position in which we are susceptible to the perverse and violent whim of bigoted trolls. But our suffering, our struggles don't excuse us from the obligation to stand with others. Precisely the opposite. Our experience, our Jewish history of pain and bigotry is the thing that obligates us to fight racism so that we can be there wholeheartedly alongside others who struggle. So for us white Jews, for those of us caught in this uncomfortable intersection between our own suffering and that of others, what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to go back to that verse from the book of Numbers that reminds us that our job is to lift up and to carry the burdens that God has assigned to us. We just have to determine which is the light burden and which is the heavy. What's the easy way out? What's the way that we convince ourselves that we're doing something meaningful about racism in America so we can sleep peacefully at night? And what's the hard thing to do? The one we cannot evade, though, because it is, in the end, the right thing. Because let's be honest, the decision to oppose racism is not in itself an especially courageous or significant one. But there are ways to act upon that decision that are meaningful and substantive and weighty. And there are ways of performing it in symbolic gestures that are light and ultimately empty. Our obligation as Jews is not just to oppose racism theoretically, on principle. Our obligation is to denounce and dismantle it. And that takes work. Real work, hard work, heavy work that is painful and embarrassing and uncomfortable. It's the kind of work that demands that all of us start with ourselves first. And I want to invite you again to join me in that uncomfortable but necessary work, because those are the gestures that are meaningful and substantive. Those are methods of doing this work that do not expect that we receive credit or acknowledgement from people of color. Those are ways that realize that we don't need affirmation or adulation for how kind and progressive we are, to admit about ourselves, and I will start, that I've done things I shouldn't have done. And I have failed to do the things I should have done. I have laughed at jokes that were aimed to hurt. I have failed to listen closely to the pain of others. I have resisted and I have rejected the chance to think critically about race and racism for years. I'll tell you, as your rabbi, as your neighbor, and as your partner, I'm trying at this work a lot, and I am not good at it very often at all. I hate seeing the ways that I have failed. I hate acknowledging my shortcomings. I hate the way that shame feels. I hate being embarrassed when I look back and remember the ways that I have acted inappropriately or cowardly in the past. I hate it. But I'm trying patiently to continue doing the work of taking responsibility for those feelings and processing them, to keep listening more than I am talking. And I'm very fortunate and very grateful that I have many resources at my disposal in this work, and so do you. We have extensive material for all of us to read so that we can educate ourselves. Incredible resources from the Union for Reform Judaism, from our Central Conference of American Rabbis, from the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, policy statements and reading lists and discussion guides, films and short videos to watch, action items to get ourselves involved with, and so on and so on. In fact, the list of resources and the reading list that I posted on the Emanu website a year and a half ago is still there, waiting and begging for you to explore it. I want to encourage you again to explore it. The link is emmanuelhouston.org/resources for exploration. We'll post that link along with some others when we repost these remarks from tonight, so you can have a chance to explore those resources at your convenience. And another resource for which I'm grateful is our community organizing core team, an extraordinary group of volunteers who, under the leadership of Rabbi Fixler and Rabbi David Siegel, have begun convening conversations and planning real substantive work about racial justice, the ways that we can bring this work first to ourselves, then to our congregation, before we go out into the community. This is critical as a part of our campaign to make our community more fair and more just. We have to start by educating ourselves. And I want to invite you to join me as I keep getting it wrong and keep trying again, so that I can learn and get better one step at a time each day. The book of Numbers tells us to list by name the objects that are assigned to be carried. That reminds us that the first step in making things better is to identify what needs to be named, what needs to be identified, what needs to be claimed as ours to lift up and hoist onto our back, as heavy and uncomfortable as it may be. And Nachmanides taught us that it's not a sin to want to shirk the heavier load. It is, after all, heavier and uncomfortable. It is a sin to refuse to carry it, because carrying that burden is what we do in the service of the holy. We have our work cut out for us already. It is now time for us to sit down and do it. The events of these recent days call out to us urgently. It is our job as people of conscience, as Jews heir to an ethical tradition, to carry this burden, not despite, but because it is heavy, and because it is ours. Shabbat Shalom.